Preview video for, I don't know, I'm going to say this a lot, one of the most extraordinary uh, sets of lines from what I believe to be the best poem in English, Paradise Lost. It's the second part of book one. And I call this the next demonic step, because so much of this chunk of the poem is the beginnings of gathering the demons together for what in book two is going to be a great council to determine how to combat God. So you can't get higher stakes than that. So when I teach this in class, every class we read the opening invocation, and that way by the end of our discussion of the poem, we will have learned by heart the opening 26 lines. So it's not a bad thing to do. I also suggest reviewing it because it's what Milton says he's going to try to achieve in the poem. And keeping that in mind as reading the poem can be really helpful. All right, so I have to say this. This is a really hard section of the poem. So particularly for these lines, you don't have to understand all of the epic similes and their ancient Greek, Hebrew, Egyptian, Roman, all the different allusions and references. What might be a good idea if you're leading a class or a book group is to have various people in the class pick one epic simile or one little passage and deep dive. But the first time you're reading it, just really relax. Okay, so I really think this is valuable. So before you crack open these lines, I would take these passages and bracket them in the margins of your book and write what I write here there. And that way you can have the sort of architecture of the book all kind of mapped out. So the very first section, and you could pause this video right now and just do this, right? But let me just walk you through it. The chapter, this section of the chapter begins with the angels rising from the fiery lake. And that's about 40 lines. We then get like very standard epic device, which is a catalog or a list. And this is one of those moments where a modern reader thinks, I can skim. You can't. Anytime you're tempted to skim in a great book, go slower. These are the list of demons that are highlighted and their associated lines and line numbers. So, like I said, jot this down. I circled the demons, circled their names, and I just think it would be handy at some point, if you have a reading group or a class, have students just pick one of these people, look at the lines closely, and look up the allusions, and then ask, what is this doing here? Third, C, is we have some music. Milton was a musician, as we know, an organist and maybe a singer. So there's a particular kind of music to how the demons move. I think that's really interesting. 567 to 621 is Satan observing the gathering of his demons. We have 622 to 662, the very important sort of pre-game address, the pre-dream address of the demons. And then Pandemonium Rises, which also sounds like a great title for a heavy metal album. But that being said, a structure that is called Pandemonium, meaning all demons, it's a word Milton invents, rises, and that's where they're going to have their big sort of council meeting to determine how to combat God. So again, if you need to pause this video, that's fine, but map this stuff out with brackets and stuff in your book before reading, and that way as you're reading you can sort of follow how the book moves. This is difficult. Okay, so I start with what I think is an obviously significant passage. So like, what would any teacher focus on? And I think it is Satan's address of the demons. And what I've bold-faced here are the times where Satan's attention shifts or the subject matter shifts or evolves. And it's my contention that like this is where we see Shakespeare in Milton, where we have a character thinking in real time. This isn't a soliloquy, it's a monologue, but we see the evolution of thought and just the layers of how Satan thinks being so incredible. This is what he says. O myriads of immortal spirits, O powers matchless, but with the Almighty. Okay, so that's his first thing, is there's so many of you, we're so powerful, we live forever, we have matchless power. And then Satan immediately remembers, except we don't match with God. Okay, so early on, it's pretty truthful. And then I have a boldface, and then he shifts. He said that strife, that battle with God, was not inglorious, though the event was dire, as this place testifies, and this dire change hateful to utter. So he says that our loss in fighting God wasn't inglorious. And then he shifts again. But what power of mind, foreseeing or presaging from the depth of knowledge, past or present, could have feared how such united force of gods, how such as stood like these, could ever know repulse? He says, how could we have known we would have lost? What kind of mind would it have taken to figure out that all of us immortal creatures could have lost? For another shift, for who can yet believe, though after loss, that all of these puissant, powerful legions, whose exile has emptied heaven, it hasn't, shall fail to reascend, self-raised, and repossess their native seat? So he asks a sort of a Shakespearean, like a rhetorical question, kind of, right? Of course we're going to regain heaven. Of course, look at us, he says. And then he develops things further. For me, be witness all the host of heaven, if counsels different or danger shunned by me have lost our hopes. But he who reigns, keyword here, monarch in heaven, God, till then, as one secure, sat on his throne. And then what holds God in power according to Satan? Old reputation. It isn't merit. It isn't reason. It's just because I'm the Father, that's why. Upheld by old repute, consent or custom, and his regal, another keyword, state, put forth at full. Another shift. But still, his strength concealed. So Satan, the great trickster, is accusing God of tricking them, of hiding his strength, which tempted our attempt. We were tempted to fight God because he hid his strength from us and created and wrought our fall. Henceforth, his might we know, and know our own, so as not to either to provoke or dread new war provoked. Okay, so they have self-awareness now and an awareness of God's power, he says. And then he shifts again. Our better part, so the thing we should do, remains to work in close design, by fraud or guile, what force effected not. We couldn't defeat God with force, so we need to use fraud or guile. We need to lie and cheat to defeat. That's the only way to do it, he says. That he no less at length from us may find. And then I put the who in boldface, because I think now he does a Hamlet, and he basically has a little moment of conceptualizing or philosophizing. Like whenever Hamlet gets uncomfortable, he becomes a scholar. He separates himself from his life and just starts thinking. Satan does that. He says, who overcomes by force has overcome but half his foe, right? If you win simply because you're stronger, you're just overcoming half of your foe. It's almost like to defeat someone fully, you have to defeat them both physically and sort of mentally and spiritually. And then he shifts again. Space may produce new worlds, whereof so rife there went a fame in heaven that he before long intended to create, and therein plant a generation whom his choice regard should favor equal to the sons of heaven. So Satan gives us some key backstory here, that part of the problem that Lucifer and the third of the demons that fell, their problem was that they heard that God was going to create a race that he held in similar regard to the angels, mankind. There, if but to pry, shall be perhaps our first eruption, there or elsewhere. There, we don't know where it is yet. It's Earth, right? So if God holds this new race in such high esteem, Satan, for the very first time, says, maybe that's where we can get back at God. And then another shift. And he gets back to the sort of present physicality of the moment. For this infernal pit, hell, shall never hold celestial spirits in bondage, nor the abyss long under darkness cover. Another shift. But these thoughts full counsel must mature. So Satan kind of maps out backstory, um, and he sort of maps out the status of the demons, what they originally thought, why they fought, and he sort of lays everything out. And then he says, we have to have a full council, a full meeting to mature these thoughts. It's really, really interesting. We're going to meet God in a few chapters. He doesn't talk that way. Shift. Peace is despaired. For who can think submission? War, then, war open or understood, must be resolved. So again, it's just a really interesting exploration of Satan's head. Something to keep in mind with any character in Shakespeare, but also in Paradise Lost, the difference between how characters talk in public versus how they soliloquize. I would say especially Satan. Here he's incredibly introspective for a monologue in front of all of his demons. And he basically says that God only won because of like his reputation, and that he was hiding all of his power. So the fallen angels, thought they could maybe defeat him. I don't know if you feel that holds water. But what I really want you to notice isn't simply like the basic things he says, but how his thoughts move, how he can go from a sort of moment of confidence to a moment of almost insecurity, how we can go from like backstory to a philosophical statement. His thoughts are just, they explore sort of every part of him in a really interesting way. Okay, so the subtle, easy to miss passage is a description of Satan a little earlier. It's what precedes the speech I just read. And Milton sort of pauses and describes Satan here. It says, he above the rest, in shape and gesture, proudly eminent, stood like a tower. And then a reference to Satan having been Lucifer in heaven, light bringer. Satan, the archangel, when he was Lucifer, was particularly luminescent. So Milton says, Satan's form had not yet lost all her original brightness, nor appeared less than archangel ruined, and the excess of glory obscured. So before we get to the epic simile, there's a really important philosophical statement and theological statement that even though he's Satan, he's ontologically good. His essence is good because his essence was created by God. He's morally evil because of the choices he's made, but his essence is good, which is why it can't lose all of its brightness because it's God created. So he refers to his glory as obscured, as like misted over and darkened. And then he pauses and gives us a really interesting epic simile that some of the censors of the day kind of had a problem with. They knew Milton's history with the monarchy. So watch what Milton says. He's basically saying, okay, what is Satan's glory like? He has this leftover glory, but it's not totally luminescent like it was in heaven. It's like, it's darker. The brightness is like ruined and it's obscured. As when the sun, new risen, looked through the horizontal misty air shorn of his beams. Okay. Or from behind the moon, in dim eclipse, disastrous twilight, sheds on half the nations, and with fear of change, perplexes monarchs. There's lots there, right? There's Milton, King Charles stuff there. There's also the fact that God in this poem is often referred to as a monarch, at least in the mouth of Satan. So what is perplexing monarchs here, and why say that? So that's something worth talking about. But again, it isn't simply that we're being told that Satan's greatness isn't all gone because he's created by God. There's still some godly essence there, even though it's obscured and darkened and ruined. But also we just think of that epic simile from earlier in this chapter, where Satan's size is compared to an island that a Norwegian sailor would compare to a huge sea animal, which would be confused for an island. So that notion of being confused and tricked. Here again, we have perplexing monarchs, that Satan is deceptive also. Darkened so, yet shone above them all the archangel. But his face, I love this, but his face deep scars of thunder had entrenched, and care sat on his faded cheek, but under brows of dauntless courage and considerate pride, waiting revenge. Cruel his eye, but cast signs of remorse and passion to behold the fellows of his crime, the followers rather, for far other once beheld in bliss, condemned forever now to have their lot in pain. So we have, Satan doing physical things, Satan's sort of status as a divine but yet ruined creature. But we also have like Satan having feelings, right? He has remorse and sort of sadness that the demons that served with him are now in pain too, which I think is interesting. It says millions of spirits for his fault immersed or deprived of heaven, and from eternal splendors flung for his revolt. So that's interesting that the poet Milton says that it was Lucifer's idea here. Yet, a shift, faithful how they stood. So it's Satan's fault that they're there, but his fellow demons are faithful. Their glory withered. Okay, so we had the description of Satan's sort of darkened luminescence. And here we have the other demon's glory withered. As when heaven's fire has scathed the forest oaks or mountain pines with singed top, their stately growth, though bare, stands on the blasted heath. Almost imagine a glorious, huge pine tree that lightning had destroyed. There's still some evidence of a pine tree, but it's singed and mostly destroyed. That's like the nature of the demons right now. He now prepared to speak, whereat their doubled ranks they bend, from wing to wing. I find this interesting. And half enclose him round, with all his peers. Attention held them mute. So they encircle him in a way, in a half circle. I feel there's drama there, but I also feel a sense of oneness and support. And they're completely attentive. They're mute. 3 times he essayed, and 3 times, in spite of scorn, tears, such as angels weep, burst forth. At last, words interwove with sighs found their way. Satan weeps before talking. It's really interesting stuff. So I think we learn a lot about Satan here before he even starts talking, right? We learn about his sort of moral and ontological status. We learned about his face. We learned about his feelings, seeing his compatriots also having fallen. And then we see just like the dramatic moment of this really interesting feeling of oneness and support before he talks. Okay, so an amazing detail, word, or line. This is really weird. One of the demons is being described. And Milton gives us this nugget. And this is purely Miltonic. I don't think in at least traditional angelology, the study of angels, I don't think they have bodies. So Milton's angels having bodies is necessary, I think, for this to be a poem, as we'll see. I think bodiless creatures in a traditional epic poem is pretty difficult. But watch what Milton says about angels or spirits. And this isn't fallen angels, this is angels, like all of them. For spirits, when they please, can either sex assume or both. So soft and uncompounded is their essence pure, not tried or manacled with joint or limb, nor founded on the brittle strength of bones like cumbrous flesh, but in what shape they choose. Dilated or condensed, bright or obscure, can execute their airy purposes and works of love or enmity fulfill. So it seems like Milton's, as I said in the opening video talking about Milton's life, that his greatest good was this idea of like personal freedom, that the angels embody that quite literally in the most dramatic way possible. They can even choose which gender they're going to embody. They can either sex assume or both. And I don't have like a thesis for you right here. I just think we're in book 1. that's a really interesting detail about some of the most interesting characters in the poem is that they have this sort of bodily uh, malleability and freedom. And then here are some things if you're teaching or you're keeping a journal or you're in a reading group. Here are some things to think about. One, select one of the demons I mentioned earlier in the summary slide. And then deep dive there. Look up some words, make some connections, and I would say journal on what makes this demon special. If you're not Satan in hell, these characters are really interesting. They have really interesting backstories, and and um, and they're there for a purpose. So see what you find. Two, deep dive into one of the many amazing epic similes. So 338 to 343, the demons are equated to Old Testament locusts. And then later in the book 767, demons are swarming like bees. There's actually a really interesting Catholic analog to that. Um, Reflect on the details of the simile itself, like figure out literally what's happening, and then what does that simile add? That's what I keep focusing on. It's good that you notice it's a simile, but why is it there? What are we learning about the thing being discussed? And then, as always, just is there anything I'm not mentioning? There's a lot of things I'm not mentioning that stands out to you. Um, anyway, this is one of the best books ever. I hope you enjoyed it.